One moment, everyone. Sorry. Please don't write on the screen. Translators, can you hear me?
Here says there's also an option of you disabling on
Yeah,
your...
I turned it off. And just reminding everyone.
Thank you.
Hello, translators, can you hear me? Monica, can you hear me? Okay. Happy Sabbath, everybody. Let's open with a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you for the opportunity to gather together. And continue our exploration about your character. As we try to examine ourselves and our worldviews, as well as examine you. I pray this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. This is our fifth and final study together. As much as I would have loved to do a recap and summary, we won't have as much time as I would have liked. So I'd like to explore another topic in relationship to what we've been discussing. As time has gone on, and we as a movement and we as humanity have matured, it's become clearer to me, at least, that one of our job functions as people is to do the following, which may seem counterintuitive at first, but it's to put God on trial. Well, let me say God is on trial, and we're the jury, and we're the judge. And as we do that, we as people have to do the difficult task of putting aside our biases, the biases of being Christians, and do a fair job of seeing whether God is just, which becomes important as we consider the idea that blessing has been dwelling on, which is the end of Christianity. The only way we could do a fair job in this trial is if Christianity comes to an end. So as part of that trial, I'd like to explore a topic that humans have had to come face to face with in relationship to justice. Over the past, I'll say, few weeks, 2 articles were shared on the media broadcast group, both about the death penalty. One of them was a newsletter. The title of that newsletter piece was Execution Nation. And in your own time, it would be good to revisit that article, because it raises a few questions about the United States history. When the USA was founded, for a long time, mass executions would take place as part of the legal system. Which ran in tension to its founding ethos. But in the 20th century, the justices that sat on the Supreme Court were faced with a case. The case, for your reference, is Furman versus Georgia, the state of Georgia. Which brought the question of the death penalty into public discussion. From a legal perspective. The outcome of that case was that the death penalty, specifically the way it was being used, broke the principles of the Constitution. The court didn't go as far as to say that the death penalty was in and of itself wrong. It stated that the rules around it were unfair. So each time it got applied, the death penalty, it wouldn't be applied consistently, which left a lot of room for the various states to rewrite their rules and try again. So as much as on the surface it may have seemed that that ruling, Furman versus Georgia, did away with the death penalty. All it did was lead to states circumventing those rules or bypassing those rules. So in 1976, that's exactly what happened. The death penalty came back. Because it didn't really die to begin with. Fast forward to the 21st century, and the picture in the United States is pretty mixed. Some states have codified that it's illegal. Some other states, like California, still sentence people to die, but don't actually go through with it. And then there are some states, your Texases, your Florida, who use it a lot more than others. So this raises the question, why is America still at this place? In 2003, someone by the name of Louis Jones Jr. was executed. And at a federal level, which means the whole country, it was the last execution that the federal level saw. And for about 17 years, there weren't any executions at a federal level. So not at a state level. But then COVID came around, 2020, 2021. So not because of COVID, but that time period. And the Attorney General, alongside Trump, the lawyer in charge of the federal government's law, made the argument that the US needed to resume executions. So executions have carried on to some degree at a federal level in the USA. When you compare the USA's stance on the matter to other democracies around the world, America's position is an outlier, is different, which leads to the question, for most of the rest of the world, why does this feel so wrong? When for a lot of human history, it didn't. If we examine that feeling, is it right? Or is it just something modern that's a preference for all these other democracies? So I want to think through that question by tracing time. There's a feeling most people carry without realizing it or testing it, which is if someone takes a life, then it must be fair that they deserve to lose their life. Or, on another hand, surely there is some crime bad enough that the death penalty is the just way of dealing with those crimes. So even if intellectually we may we may claim that the death penalty is wrong, there's still this tension in a lot of people which feels that to take a life, then your life must be taken. Underneath that tension is a question, which is who gets to decide where that line of criminality is that warrants taking a life. So I'm not going to answer that. It's just a question for you to think about in your own time. What I do want to do is explore some of the arguments for the death penalty. What are some of the reasons that we can think of that point to it being a just way of dealing with crime? Obviously, we're not together in person, so this is just a one-person exercise. But in your own time, try and think of reasons of why the death penalty would be necessary. So I've come up with 5. And the first one is that the punishment needs to match the crime. So if you think of murder, the thinking goes that the only thing that would match murder is death. So one reason to punish, generally speaking, is that it helps society, it helps people. It stops future crime, and so it keeps everyone safe. So when I list match the crime, What I'm suggesting in this argument is that even if punishing a person helped nobody at all, then death would still be owed for murder. Think of it this way. If someone did something truly wrong, inside us we feel they deserve a consequence. Not because the consequences fix anything or protects anyone, but just because what they did deserves a punishment. So in this argument, it's based on this idea of justice. Not that it keeps us safe, just that that's what's owed. Whether you agree with that line of reasoning is up to you. But a second argument I can think of is the idea of giving up rights. Ironically, John Locke made this argument. We should all be familiar with who that person is. But his argument went along these lines. Imagine if rights were like an agreement between people, a social contract. Everyone agrees to protect everyone else's right to life. And in return, your own life is protected too. So once you get a murderer that breaks that agreement, they take someone else's right to life. In that agreement between people, they didn't keep their end of the deal. So what happens to their own protection of their right to life? And John Locke's answer is that it's gone, it goes away. Not because anyone took it from them, that right to life, but because they already broke the deal that was protecting them. So their own right to life isn't being taken away from someone else. They give it up the moment they break the social agreement. So there's that line of reasoning that one could use to support the premise of using the death penalty. I'm not going into these in detail, but I'm just leaving these as avenues for you to explore. Think of the reasonability of the argument. A third possible avenue is based on the idea that it stops future crimes. So think about what actually stops most people from doing something wrong. For a lot of people, it's not a moral argument or philosophical one. As human beings, we're emotional, and emotions are what drive us. So if you want to keep people in line, and stop them from doing future crimes, what do you target? Do you target their logic or their reasoning capacity? Or do you frame it around how humans are built? And so this line of reasoning is built on the idea that you can get people to behave through fear of consequences. If you're building a society, then fear can be used on purpose. If you make the punishment serious enough, then sorry, then people would think twice. So the threat of execution stops future murderers. Which would be more effective than any smaller punishment. Given everything we've been learning about the development of God's relationship with humans, does this seem reasonable? A fourth argument in support of the death penalty is find something, a consequence, that would make sure that a bad action never happens again. So avoid the repetition of heinous crimes, of bad crimes. So if you were to think of prison, for example, it keeps someone away from most people, but it's not perfect. Someone could escape. Someone could hurt another prisoner. Or one day, that mass murderer could be released. Execution is different because once you execute someone, there's no scenario left where that person kills again. So not in prison, or out of it, or ever. And the last argument is similar to the first, which is an eye for an eye. When people hear this phrase, it could strike the thought that it's based on an idea of revenge. But it means the opposite. Because revenge has no natural limit. An eye for an eye says stop. The punishment has to be in line or be the same amount as the crime. So the idea is limiting. Limit the punishment, not a license to do what you want. So if you want to build a just society, these are some of the reasons I could think of, at least, that would justify using execution. If we were in a class together, I say I would have loved to hear your opinions. And instead of arguing against these, I want to try and trace humanity itself and how humanity has wrestled with this question across history and see where it leads. So I've populated the line out in full because of time. So I'll point us where we are at each stop. So if we were to stretch our minds back to the oldest laws that we have records of, one of the earliest is what was known as Hammurabi's Code, which was formulated in ancient Babylonia, some generations before Nebuchadnezzar. But that legal framework began to shape geographies across the regions. And it covered as many wrongs as possible. But one of the underlying premises was that the state needed to be hard on crime. Don't hold back. This is where we can trace the term eye for an eye from. So there's some semblance of rights at the beginning. Because remember, we said eye for an eye is about justice and balance. But even in that framework, balance wasn't as intuitive as you might think of it today. because death was used for different crimes, not just violence. Even crimes about property could lead to death. But if you asked someone living under this system whether that seemed like too much, they would probably have said no. Because to them, harsh punishment simply showed that things mattered in life. It was normal. Time goes on and empires evolve and rise and fall. And Greece starts to gain prominence in the world. Athens was the hub of intellectual debate. And so a lawyer stands up named Draco, and he writes a legal code. His laws were extremely harsh. So even small crimes like stealing food could lead to death. I'll just indicate with a highlighter where we are on our line. And people at the time had a saying about his laws. Because they were so harsh, then Draco must have written them in blood, not ink. This is where we get the word draconian from. At the time, someone asked him a question, which was, Mr. Draco, under your legal system, why are small crimes and big crimes the same in your eyes? In the sense that they got the same punishment. And his answer, he said that, well, any crime, your small crimes are still crime. And since they're crime, and those small crimes deserve death, then there's no bigger punishment to give worse crimes. So he starts from the premise that crime is crime, which sounds similar to sin is sin. So in Draco's legal framework, death was the only tool at his disposal. And once that's the case, every crime begins to look the same. Rome starts to rise up, ancient Rome, and they did something differently. But it changed across the centuries. Something that was new that they introduced was that how someone was executed depended on their status in society, not just their crime. So being nailed to a cross, for instance, was kept for a specific group of people. Slaves or rebels, or people who weren't citizens. Roman citizens got a different treatment. Usually less brutal ways of dying. But for the exact same crime. And this is the first place, in history at least, where we see something new creep in. The death penalty stops being only about crime, and it gets tied to who a person is. Eventually, time passes, and we get to the medieval ages. And England at the time, I'm just using England as an example, which was the case with all other nations, it listed over 200 crimes that were worthy of death. Even something as small as cutting down a young tree. So this was an era where punishment got extremely harsh. The punishments that were dished out that were used happened in public, and it was brutal on purpose because it was tied to this idea of fear. It needed to be a warning to everyone watching. This was the reasoning behind public executions. But then something began to change during the Enlightenment age. People stood up. I've just named one. I'll probably butcher his name. Cesare Bessaria. He writes a book that's going to revolutionize the world. In 1764, called On Crimes and Punishment. And humanity's relationship with crime begins to change. And his argument isn't based on religious affiliation. He's not making a religious argument, but he bases his argument on this idea of rights. So he's not saying that the death penalty gets used too much. He's saying the principle of the death penalty is wrong at its core. And as these governments are developing around the world, or at least in the New World, his premise is that a government doesn't have the right to take away a person's life. Because as these governments are being created by the people, there's no part of that deal that says that once we've created you, you can then take my life at some point in the future. And in his mind, there's no crime that warrants taking someone's life. His ideas begin to spread, and by the 1800s, most of Europe's laws had changed. The list of crimes worthy of the death penalty eventually boiled down to about two: murder or betraying your country. That was radical given where humanity had come from. For thousands of years, the list of death-worthy crimes only ever grew. They got more and more. And this is the point where they start shrinking, where they start getting less and less. A reason why this happens at this time period is because an institution gets stronger, and that institution is prisons. They become strong enough to keep criminals away from other people. And once that became true, death wasn't the only option to keep people safe, which opens up a new possibility, which is that a person kept safely away for as much time as needed might change, given enough time. So a person's being stops being tied to the worst moment that they could experience. A person isn't only what their worst moment says about them. So a murderer, that murder starts to stop defining their being. Because of this awareness that they have the opportunity to reform. Eventually, we get to post-World War II, and the LIO starts to form, with the United Nations developing and writes the Declaration of Human Rights. And in that declaration, they make clear that a person's life, or the right to life, is inalienable. So not given by any government, and so if not given, then can't be taken away from any government. That's the that's the context of humanity's development in relationship to this idea of the right to life and relationship with the death penalty. Because post the Second World War, as countries began to democratize, the death penalty starts being abolished. In relationship to this idea that a person's life is theirs and no government has the right to take it away. The Bible goes through its own development in relationship to this idea of death for crime. In its legal history, in the societies that the Bible covers. So the first reference, Genesis 9 verse 6. Apologies, translators. I didn't give it to you beforehand. So I'll just read it live. But it says, whoever sheds someone's blood, their blood will be shed by someone else. Because humans are created in God's image. That's a paraphrase. But the death penalty shows up here for murder, but it's based directly on this idea of humans being created in God's image. So even at the very start, This legal framework has this principle undergirding it. The principle that a person's being has worth. Even though legally things still need time to develop to understand that completely. We get ancient Israel rise up, and it's going to be formalized as a society. In the book of Numbers, a bunch of laws are going to be stated. But Moses is going to institute cities of refuge, which created a real difference in comparison to the societies around them. In recognition that there was a difference between killing someone by accident and murder. A case had to be heard before anyone could get executed. Even this early in Scripture's legal history, the law refused to treat one bad outcome as the whole truth about a person. An accident and a real crime were kept separate. Which were early signs that a person was never seen as good, as only as good, as their worst moment. In that time period at Sinai, laws get formalized, and this is against the backdrop of the legal world of Hammurabi. So if we compare the two, not with the ambition of seeing which one was better than the other, but just doing that comparison, when you read through the law of Moses, there were different safeguards built into the legal code. Built into the legal code. Different. Sorry. And so the reason why those safeguards were built in, safeguards like the necessity of having 2 or 3 witnesses, or the idea that a false witness would receive the same punishment they tried to cause someone else, was to deter this idea of execution as much as it could. That much care only makes sense if one thing were true, that ending someone's life was treated as too serious to risk getting wrong. Which is really just another way of saying that their worth mattered a lot. Around the time of the Christian church and thereafter, Jewish lawyers would stand up and examine their legal framework. And rabbis would debate the legal system and its justness. And there was this recognition in the debates that were held that the court should deter death as much as it could. They would say something along the following lines: that a court that executes even once in 7 years should be considered bloodthirsty. So even amidst Jewish legal tradition, there was this move towards almost never using executions or the death penalty. So in two separate areas, I'll say humanity's awakening and scriptures, two roads came to the conclusion that the death penalty wasn't an appropriate way to deal with crime. If we think back about what we've been discussing over the last few weeks, it's been based on this idea of equality. In 2024, I think it was in Slovakia. My translator can correct me if I'm wrong. Translate. We explored what this term means, equality. What do we mean when we say that all people are equal? And different propositions were given. Is it about ability? And we said no. Is it about outcome? And we said no. It wasn't even about the idea of treating everyone exactly the same. The idea of equality is built on this idea of inherent worth. That people, just by being people, carry the same basic worth before anything is known about them. So, as we've explored over the last few weeks, a question that I secretly tried to answer for myself is, could that worth move? Whether it's good behavior adding to it or bad behavior taking away from it. Could equal still be true if that were the case? And whether it's through exploring the idea of meritocracies or the conditionality that's baked into the old covenant, at least for myself, the conclusion that I arrived to is that inherent worth is static. It doesn't and it cannot move. In 2020, if you remember that dispensation, we used to mark a waymark here with a small little waymark. And now we've been told off that that's not accurate. But events in that dispensation pointed to something, which was where we began to start questioning this idea of death. I don't want to frame it as the death decree, but this dispensation of harvest gave us the opportunity to be face to face with what inherent worth means in relationship to a criminal. Because when George Floyd was murdered, arguments arose in relationship to his character. People pointed to his criminal record, to his struggles with drugs and alcohol. But when everyone held up banners saying BLM, the response was clear that none of that mattered. Nothing about his past behavior or current behavior made it right to take his life. So today, as we sit in the harvest, it's no surprise to myself that this is a question that we have to face or be confronted with. Do we see justice in the idea of a death penalty? So we've explored humanity's relationship with death for crime, and touched on principles that God tried to instill in scripture while still working with the people that lived in a world around them. So now I want to trace a line with the time that I have left of this idea of the final judgment. Because it's the same question that humanity has asked itself in relationship of how to deal with crime. So we've explored what humans do to each other under law. So now what about God? Because now God's on trial. So let's see where we land when we explore what God would do to the criminals in the final judgment. We'll go quickly through this story. But throughout the Old Testament, there was a consistent thread that describes what happens to someone who dies, whether they're good or they're bad. And the answer was death, their mortal lives. What you don't find throughout the Old Testament is a detailed picture of wicked suffering forever, consciously, without an end to that suffering. Through the Old Testament, that idea just isn't there, as we know. But then Alexander rises up in Greece and starts to take over the world, and something changes. Jewish and later Christian thinking comes in contact with Greek philosophy, which starts asking the questions about our souls. And where Greek philosophy landed at the time is that the soul can't die, no matter what. Obviously framed within their understanding of the gods. But the premise was that the soul can't die. So once you believe that, then the question changes. The question being, what happens to the wicked? It stops being a question that mortal final death can answer. And it becomes a question about what a thing that can't be destroyed experiences forever instead. And conceptually, this is the first major step in severity, in harshness. Augustine becomes influential. I still have 10 minutes. Becomes important in the church's history Because he shapes the Western Church's teaching that suffering never ends, and he takes that and makes it the official belief of the church. There's some pushback, but this doctrine becomes entrenched in the church. The church grows, and now that doctrine starts to get used for the institution's own power. Because vivid pictures start being painted about hell alongside this other related teaching about purgatory that ends up, I'll say, funding the indulgences of the Catholic Church, which is paying money in exchange for less suffering. There's some pushback against this premise by Luther and Calvin during the Reformation, and they reject this idea of purgatory and this corruption by the church, but they don't touch the core belief, this idea of hell and eternal suffering. And eventually the Millerite movement and Adventism rise up, and they challenge this idea of eternal suffering. Systematically, they break down this belief that a person, soul, would be in eternal torment if they were wicked. And it stops there. Because this correction in the road in, I'll say, God's people's understanding corrected which kind of consequence the wicked faces. But it never asks the deeper question underneath that. Which I'm suggesting we ask now. Which is whether death itself, used as a punishment for sin, is something anyone has the right to hand out. And that anyone includes God. Does God, who is bound by a law of equality, have the right to use the death penalty to deal with criminals, to deal with sinners? I'll leave you to answer that for yourselves. But if we hold in our minds the theme that we've been tracing, this idea of inherent worth, of God being under the law, then you can be able to trace the logical conclusion. As we balance salvation and the counterpart, punishment, and what is the just thing for God to do with all these sinners and criminals we don't like. I'll close with reminding us of a line that we would draw called Eden to Eden. We framed it as the degradation and restoration of humanity. We said that the first test of humanity, or the first place where humans began to fall, was in relationship to gender. And then I'll just say worship and race. And then in the Millerite time period, humanity began to address these issues by dealing with slavery, and we would say in the 1888 history, the idea of liberty of conscience was addressed. Ooh, how do you spell conscience? Liberty of thinking, because I can't spell conscience. And we would say that today, humanity is confronting sexism. In this chiasm of restoration. What's interesting to me is that when we explored gender and slavery, these human to human relationships, we easily concluded that the conclusions that we come to in relationship to gender, that a person's sex or gender doesn't define their worth on earth. So if it didn't define a person's worth here on earth, then for sure it couldn't define a person's worth in heaven. God wouldn't see a man and a woman differently. And the same said about race or nationalities, is that we could easily make that jump between the human and the human, or the natural, to make conclusions about the spiritual. But with worship or liberty of conscience, we didn't make that jump of seeing the natural in this story and making the conclusions about the spiritual. Because that was one area where, of course, God could use the death penalty. Because God is built different. But that just seems inconsistent to me. So in your own time, to close, think about whether the death penalty is an appropriate way to deal with crime. In our societies, sure, the USA may be an outlier amongst the democracies in the world, but what's to say the other democracies got it right? Once you answer that question, what is bound on earth gets bound in heaven. As we are created in God's image, then something about the way humans think and believe should help us to understand how God thinks and what God believes. We'll close because we're over time. But hopefully in Portugal, I'll be able to go through some of the questions that may have arisen from the studies that I've done over the last few weeks. Let's close in a word of prayer. Dear God, I appreciate that you take no offense in being on trial. It's what your government is built on, I think, which is justice. And as we explore these questions about what is right and what is lawful, I pray that we may be able to put aside our biases so that you can have a fair trial. And we as humanity could resolve the tension that we've been grappling with for ourselves. About who you are and what we've read. I pray this in Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Curtis, for that wonderful presentation. And I trust we all have been blessed. We'll now have a 15-minute break, and the Zoom will open after 15 minutes. Let's take this time to think upon these things and return for the next presentation. God bless.